Hello, everyone. I have the pleasure today of speaking with John Cottingham. Um, John is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Reading, Professional Research Fellow at Haythorpe College at the University of London, Visiting Professor for the Philosophy Department at King's College London, and Honorary Fellow at St John's College, Oxford. And the research of John's John's research interests throughout his career have been early modern philosophy, particularly Descartes, moral philosophy, and the philosophy of religion. So John published.
Just
Oh, yeah.
Just a very quick addendum. Haythorpe College, University of London, where I had a part-time position after retiring from Reading, has sadly closed now. So that's which is very sad, because it was the only institution that was devoted especially to philosophy of religion. They just did philosophy and theology there. So that's a sad loss to the academic world. But it now consists of just a library, the Haythorpe Library, but no longer exists as an institution. So
That's sad to hear.
Added that, yeah.
Well, and so today, the purpose of our discussion today is that John has published a paper last year entitled "Which Naturalism," and today we're going to discuss that paper and some of the questions which arise from it. Welcome, John. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Very nice to be here.
So firstly, to give the audience an overall sense of what is at issue in the paper, Which Naturalism, you make the case that, to quote, there has been a radical shift in the metaphysical construal of the concept of nature. And I wanted to open with asking how you understand this shift in broad terms, and what some of the main differences are between earlier metaphysical construals of nature and those which some naturalists hold today.
Yeah, that goes to the heart of the paper, really. Well, in a way, the motivation for the paper was a feeling that the terms nature and natural have been kind of hijacked by secularists, by that very large segment of analytic philosophy which has abandoned theism in favor of a resolutely secular and atheist worldview. And so, for example, Brian Leiter talks about the naturalistic revolution in philosophy, by which he means basically the idea that philosophy should work really in tandem with the natural sciences, and that the sciences describing the empirical world represent all the reality there is, to put it very crudely. And of course, that's led to this endless problem of how we fit in to this austere, scientifically described world, how we fit in value and meaning. Because that seems to lie outside of nature, in the sense of the succession of empirically describable events, or the succession of mathematically modelable events. And what I was trying to do in the paper was to show that if you go back a little bit, the term nature is used in a very different way. It doesn't just mean the brute facts, the empirical facts. It means, on the contrary, an organized world, a cosmos, in the Greek sense of something imbued with order, value, and meaning. And many of the connotations of natural in classical Greece, in medieval philosophy, for example, Aquinas, and in the early modern, even in the early modern period, Descartes, for example. The connotations of natural are quite different from the modern ones. Nature is, for example, the natural law in Thomas Aquinas is the moral law, the law ordained by God. The natural light in Descartes is a divinely bestowed faculty of reason, which enables us to discern truths, objective truths about mathematics, and indeed also objective truths about morality. So nature and natural have this much richer sense. So that was the basic contrast of the paper.
Mm-hmm. And but perhaps this is a big question, but do you have a sense of what sort of happened as a cause of sort of what has changed from early modernity into our contemporary uses of the term nature? Why it is that this transformation and this shift has occurred?
Right. I mean, that would be, to give a proper account of that, I think would take a massive volume. But I suppose roughly what happened was the so-called Enlightenment happened. And Hume in particular, as you know, has the idea of the natural world as a mere succession of events, just to slightly caricature his view, one darn thing after another. And there are no inherent connections, or at least if there are, they're beyond human ken. I don't discuss this in the paper, but there's a dispute about Hume. Some people think he's a kind of very raw empiricist, that there is just this succession of empirical events with no connections, no necessary connections, and no value except what we project or impose onto it. There's another view of Hume that it is more of a skeptic, that he thinks there may be ultimate connections and principles, but if so, we could never find them. That, as he says, the ultimate springs and principles of nature, I'm quoting from memory, are utterly shut up from human curiosity and inquiry. And that other great Enlightenment figure, Kant, Immanuel Kant, takes a similar line, really, that our knowledge, our scientific knowledge, is confined to this world, the phenomenal world of empirically determinable events, and that if there is a world beyond that, we can speculate about it, but we get lost in endless contradictions. So that's the Enlightenment, which kind of shuts the door on these sorts of things that Plato and Christian philosophers believed in, an objective realm of meaning and value.
Mm-hmm. So that leads into one of the next questions I had, which was actually about, and it's interesting discussing the Enlightenment, because around that time there were figures who were responsive to this shutting the door, which you talked about. The Romantics, who kept a sense of the way value discloses itself to us. So what I wanted to sort of transition into here was what the relationship between art and technology, which is something you address in the paper. Because if scientific naturalism doesn't have room for accounting for value, then we might want to account for value. We might want to account for things like truth and goodness in the world. But there are two kinds of value which you touch on in the paper. And I think this is from G. Moore, the intrinsic value and instrumental value. And I'm going to try and put this into a more concise question. To what I suppose, what role does art and imagination have to play in a broadly theistic naturalism, in a construal of naturalism which wants to affirm that there is indeed value in nature?
It's a very good question. I don't explicitly discuss this in the paper, but there's a kind of agenda I have, which I call the humane philosophy agenda, which several of my papers have touched on, which is a main sort of platform or plank in that, is that I think philosophy should be more sensitive to the imagination than many analytic philosophers would welcome or allow. There's a sort of very pared down, austere model of how we should philosophize, as you know, which is sort of just, let's keep it to the formal structures of validity, and any kind of, this actually goes right back to Plato. There's a prejudice against the arts and the imagination as potentially distorting. And examples are occasionally wheeled in, but they're just examples. They don't really affect the purity of the argument. Now, that seems to me a very odd view of philosophy. Why shouldn't philosophy draw on all the resources of the human spirit, the human mind, including the sorts of resources supplied by literature, poetry, the arts, and the imagination? Now, to pick up directly on your question, the imagination is often thought of by people to be just making things up. You know, the old word for the imagination that Shakespeare uses, fancy, just fanciful, making up things that aren't really there. But quite a lot of theologians have discussed this issue recently, like Rowan Williams and Judith Wolfe, two very gifted philosopher theologians, I'd call them. And what they claim is that the imagination, yes, there's an element of poiesis, of making, of human construction, but it's not just that. It's also responsive to what's really there. And I think we see that in great works of art. We don't just say, oh, this is something the artist made up. Yes, it is a creative enterprise, but it reveals, it discloses something about the nature of whatever we're discussing, of love or of beauty or of human relations or whatever. So that part of the paper about enframing basically was the idea that the artist applies a kind of framework of interpretation, but one that at the same time uncovers or discloses certain aspects of reality. And I think poetic language does that, and I think theological language does that. And I think philosophy can do that too. There may be, as Wittgenstein might have put it or did put it, maybe there's certain things that can't be said in the pared down language of science, but they can perhaps be shown by recourse to imaginative, metaphorical, and other enriched modes of discourse.
Yeah, thank you. And in the section on enframing, you're discussing Heidegger's essay on technology as well. Is it fair to construe technology as in some way opposed to what you've, as the opposite of what you've just said there about art, in as much as it frames nature in terms of its instrumental use or its standing reserve, I think is the term Heidegger uses. You know, as opposed to perhaps the way that the tree speaks to the poet or something like that.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm certainly not a Heidegger expert, but I think Heidegger is arguing in that question concerning technology that the technological revolution has posed certain dangers of reducing everything to a sort of network of resources to be exploited for our own ends, for their instrumental value. It's really just that the idea of inframing doesn't have to be negative in that way. There can be other frameworks of interpretation which, so far from disenchanting the world, to use that famous Weber phrase, actually they don't, not so much re-enchant it as they disclose a beauty and a mystery that's already there. And you mentioned art and poetry and so on. I mean, the poetry of Wordsworth, I'm not sure if I quote from it in that paper, but I often do in my writings. He's very much concerned to show the reader the richness and beauty of the natural world, so that it's not just the environment, you know, there to be used and exploited. On the contrary, it's something which is infused. I mean, a theist like the poet Hopkins would say it's charged with the grandeur of God. That's to say, it's not just that we are putting something into it, it's rather that we discern in nature a genuine beauty and richness, and Wordsworth says goodness. And of course, the Judeo-Christian tradition says just that there's a goodness at the heart of nature, despite all the problems, particularly in human nature. There is a fundamental orientation to the good. I think I say something about that towards the end of the paper. Can I just pause 1 second? I'll be back in just literally 2 seconds.
And so this all leads to the next question, which, and this is a point you mentioned in the paper, that there's a point of contact between secular naturalism on the one hand and what you term theistic naturalism on the other, in as much as both seem to be in some way responsive to the wonder, the awe of the natural world. I think you speak of Otto's Mysterium Tremendum, this great sense of, well, awe really, and do you suppose that there's a way in which the secular naturalism isn't able to fully shut out this sense of value, not able to fully stick to the empirical phenomena, in as much as there has to be some I don't know, what way in which nature is charged with meaning and value in the first place, for one to be motivated to contemplate it and to investigate it and to ask questions of it and try to understand
Yeah.
its structure.
Yes. Yes. I mean, in the paper, I quote Richard Dawkins, who's, of course, the arch atheist of our time, but using language to describe the cosmos, the Milky Way galaxy, for example, this incredible, shimmering, radiant sight, which sadly we can't see so much as previous generations because we've polluted the night sky. But if one goes to say lesser populated parts of the middle of America or Australia, the sight is actually quite overwhelming, and scientists who use telescopes even more so find this. So those feelings of wonder and awe, you don't have to be religious to feel them. They're part of our human birthright. It could be that Hume is right, and it's just we who are, as Hume says, the mind has a tendency to spread itself on external objects. It could just be coming from us. But I don't think that's how it presents itself. When you contemplate the night sky and are struck dumb with wonder, as Dawkins admits he is, it doesn't feel like an endogenous sort of funny internal buzz. It feels like a response to something that's there. And it seems to me that the scientist is discovering things of mind-numbing intricacy, which require the most complex and intricate mathematics to map them. So it's not as if our puny brains are imposing order on things. On the contrary, we're managing to discern through the brilliance of scientists just some fraction of that extraordinary order. The Greek word cosmos, of course, is an ordering, etymologically. So we're seeing something which is, well, the theist would say it manifests logos, in some deep sense manifests order, rational intelligibility might be the way of putting it.
Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, you make a very interesting turn in the paper towards the end, towards, how can I say it? There's a way. Well, Kant talked about the starry heavens above and the moral law within. And there's a way in which, when we look at the Milky Way or the stars or nature around us, we're sort of observing nature. I want to use the word outwardly or something like this. We're observing empirical and observable things that we can measure and look at their structure. But you pointed out that there is another kind of nature, which is our own human nature, and that this is justifiably another aspect of what we might understand of as nature. And so yeah, I wonder, like, is there do you see some qualitative difference between those kinds of nature? Is that a misleading distinction? Like, is it, if I discern sort of moral law or a sense of goodness and truth to which my own nature is oriented, is this a distinct kind of nature to perhaps the natural laws which govern the stars and the sun this kind of thing?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Certainly, I think in the paper I quote Descartes a bit, who does talk quite a lot about nature as the mathematically describable external, what we call the external world, but also about human nature. And he describes both in the sixth meditation as divinely ordained structures, to put it somewhat loosely. So by nature, in the sense of the world, he says, it's, quote, nothing else but the ordered system of created things established by God. And then as regards, excuse me, as regards human nature, it is, of course, subject to error. That's a recurring theme in many philosophers, including Descartes. But nonetheless, in a fundamental way, Descartes believes in the natural light, that you and I and all human beings have been endowed from birth with what we might call a capacity to discern the truth and to discern the good. And what I argue in the final section of the paper is we can't really give up on that. It may seem, given the mess that we are in, sort of hopelessly optimistic. But actually, unless we did, at some fundamental level, think our minds are fitted to sort out the true from the false, then we couldn't be having this discussion, really. The whole enterprise of philosophizing presupposes not that we're right, we often make mistakes, but that at least in principle, we have some power of sorting out the muddled from the clear, the false from the true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually the same is true in the moral sphere, that the very enterprise of practical reason, trying to work out the best thing to do, presupposes that we have some orientation towards the good, or some power to discern what is good. Otherwise, life would be a total mess. I mean, maybe it is a mess. In fact, Bernard Williams famously, well, not famously, in one of his passages said that as a result of Darwinian evolution and the general contingency of how we got here, we humans are to some degree a mess, which is a phrase very resonant phrase one can't help rather liking. But I think that's got to be mitigated to some extent. If we were a complete mess, then no rational discussion could even get off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah.
And so I suppose finally, a question that was on my mind after reading the paper was the nature of this good. So if it is so that we inhabit a cosmos, as you say, which has a rational order to it, and it is not sheer chaos, because I suppose that's what a mess writ large would be sheer chaos with no order whatsoever. So if that is the case, and if our natures are in some way responsive to a good, it seems to me that this good has an immaterial, it is in some way immaterial. So that at least in the sense Descartes spoke of matter as having extension or having some corporeal aspect, some physical extension. These images of the natural light being responsive to truth and goodness. This seems to be a kind of naturalism which would have room for a immaterialism, or a sense of nature as going beyond the merely material. Yeah.
Right. Yes. That's a very interesting question, which I perhaps didn't cover, at least not to any extent in the paper. I do attempt to address it in my most recent book called In Search of the Soul, which came out a year or two ago. The paper that came out last year. And there I don't actually go for the immaterial solution. I prefer to go down the road Aristotle sketched out, which is basically, yes, there is a formal aspect to reality. If you like, that's immaterial in a certain sense. But it's not, as it were, a separate realm of Platonic forms or Descartes' immaterial ghosts or spirits. It's rather that we are human beings, we are biological creatures, but our bodies are configured or informed, organized. Aristotle uses the word ensouled, empsukos, in such a way as to allow for reasoning and sensation and thought and so on. So we don't have to posit, our ontology can still be, as it were, rooted in the physical world, albeit in this enriched sense of a world that is informed, which manifests patterns of rationality and which is, as I argue in the paper, configured towards the good. That's a kind of brief answer, but I think it shows that you don't have to go, philosophically speaking, you don't have to go down Plato's or Descartes' immaterialist route to validate these considerations we've been discussing.
Well, that's really helpful. Well, thank you, John, for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it, and I thought that was that we'd covered a lot there.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk, and thank you for your very, if I may say so, very well focused questions, which have been great to discuss.